Welcome to Thunga's Storytime. Today, we're diving into a part of American history that's been buried under cowboy hats and Hollywood myths. You've heard the legends, duels at high noon, fearless pioneers, freedom on the open plains. But what if I told you the real Wild West was a brutal, filthy, disease-ridden nightmare you definitely wouldn't survive? This isn't your high school textbook version. This is the raw, unfiltered story of what life was actually like on the American frontier, and it's not for the faint of heart. From deadly diseases and sky-high prices to lawless towns and broken dreams, the truth will make you question everything you thought you knew. So grab your blanket, get cozy, and prepare for a tale that's more chilling than thrilling. Let's uncover the real Wild West, only on Thunga's Storytime. The Wild West wasn't a movie. It was a daily fight for survival. When most Americans picture the Wild West, they imagine dusty duels at high noon, heroic cowboys tipping their hats, and vast, untouched landscapes where freedom reigns supreme. It's a vision shaped by decades of Hollywood films, dime novels, and pop culture, a romanticized frontier of adventure, justice, and opportunity. But the truth? The real American West was anything but romantic. If you had stepped out of your home in the late 1800s and into the western frontier, you wouldn't have found yourself in a John Wayne movie. You would have found yourself in a punishing, lawless land where disease, hunger, violence, and isolation were your daily companions. The Wild West wasn't a fantasy, it was a place of brutal survival, and chances are, you wouldn't have lasted long. A world built on suffering. Forget the glamour. The real frontier was unforgiving and indifferent to your dreams. Settlers, miners, farmers, cowboys, most didn't ride into the sunset. They worked their fingers to the bone in hostile environments, faced endless hardships, and died young. Basic necessities we take for granted today were rare luxuries back then. Clean water? Scarce. Sanitation? Practically non-existent. Bathtubs were a once-a-season luxury, and people often lived with a persistent layer of crime. The stench of sweat, livestock, smoke, and decay clung to everything. In towns where water was diverted or dried up, entire communities were left helpless against waves of disease. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid didn't care how fast you could draw a gun, they wiped out whole families. And hygiene wasn't the only threat. The environment itself seemed designed to kill you. Winters brought freezing winds that cut through crude wooden shacks and sod houses. Summers scorched the land into dust. There were no thermostats, no insulation, no reliable shelter from the elements. Rattlesnakes might slip into your bedroll, mosquitoes swarmed the stagnant creeks, and even a simple cut could lead to deadly infection. Hollywood left out the boredom, the back-breaking work, and the despair. In the movies, life on the frontier is all gunfights, saloons, and cattle drives. In reality, it was long days of unrelenting physical labor with little to show for it. Whether you were digging ditches, herding cattle, or harvesting barely edible crops, work began at sunrise and often continued past dark. There were no weekends. No vacations. No health insurance. Farmers battled rocky, unforgiving soil, endless droughts, swarms of locusts, and a complete lack of modern farming tools. Miners spent their days in dark, unstable tunnels, inhaling toxic dust and praying the ceiling wouldn't collapse. Cowboys, far from being the swaggering heroes of legend, often died young from accidents, animal attacks, or simple exhaustion. Even in towns, life was grim. Roads turned to mud with the slightest train, and buildings were slapped together from whatever materials settlers could find. Insects infested everything: food, beds, even the water supply. And for those hoping to strike it rich, most ended up poorer than when they arrived. Community didn't always mean comfort. Despite the myth of tight-knit frontier communities, many settlers lived in deep isolation. Your nearest neighbor might be 5 miles away, and if a storm or illness hit, help wasn't coming. Mail was slow. News from back east could be months old. Loneliness wasn't just a mood, it was a health hazard. Mental illness, depression, alcoholism, and suicide were tragically common, especially during long, brutal winters. And the famed Western hospitality? It came with a heavy dose of suspicion. People were armed. Everyone was a stranger. and one wrong word could mean violence. You didn't stroll into a saloon looking for trouble, because trouble usually found you first. Reality versus myth. The gunslinger illusion. Hollywood wants you to believe the West was full of noble duels and quick-draw legends. In reality, most acts of violence weren't epic standoffs, they were drunken fights, robberies gone wrong, or vigilante revenge killings. Gunfights did happen, but they were messy, terrifying, and often fatal for innocent bystanders. Many frontier towns had strict gun laws. You had to check your weapons at the edge of town, like at Dutch City. The frontier wasn't defined by justice, but by a lack of it. Lawmen were scarce, and courts were overwhelmed. That left room for mob rule, lynchings, and outlaw gangs to thrive. If someone wronged you, your best option might be to pack up and disappear, or hope the local vigilantes didn't make the situation worse. Why it matters today. Why does this matter? Because the myth of the Wild West still shapes how Americans think about freedom, self-reliance, and violence. It colors our politics, our storytelling, and our identity. But by ignoring the real hardships, we lose touch with what the frontier truly was, not a land of limitless opportunity, but a battleground where survival required grit, luck, and endless sacrifice. The people who lived there weren't cowboys in shining hats, they were exhausted, overworked, often desperate individuals who endured things most of us can't imagine. And in remembering them, we owe them more than myths. We owe them honesty. The Wild West was miserable, and it smelled like it too. If you thought the brutal isolation and constant danger were the worst parts of frontier life, brace yourself, the everyday living conditions were just as unforgiving. It wasn't just the loneliness or the violence. It was the dirt under your fingernails, the stench in your clothes, and the bone-deep exhaustion that never quite went away. The romantic image of rugged cowboys and hardy pioneers fades fast when you look at the realities of hygiene, housing, and daily labor. Life in the Wild West was filthy, exhausting, and deeply uncomfortable. Water was life, and often not even that. Clean water is something most modern Americans don't think twice about. In the 1800s Western frontier, it was a luxury that determined who lived and who died. Most settlers didn't have access to wells or running water. They fetched it by hand from rivers, creeks, or rain barrels, sources often tainted by livestock waste, dead animals, and bacteria. Bathing wasn't part of anyone's routine. If you were lucky, you might wash once every few weeks. In winter, you might go months without touching a drop of warm water. Soap was hard to come by, and indoor plumbing didn't exist. Instead, people used outhouses, chamber pots, or worse, holes in the ground. The smell was constant. So was the risk of illness. Without sanitation, entire towns became breeding grounds for cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. Boiling drinking water helped, but most didn't know to do it. Children died from diarrhea. Adults fell ill from parasites. A simple drink from a dirty stream could kill you in days. And this was normal. People got used to the smell of unwashed bodies, open sewage, and rotting waste. Flies buzzed in every corner. Clothes were rarely cleaned. Bedding was infested. Even food preparation areas were often filthy, because there was no other option. Work that crushed the body and spirit. Daily life demanded constant physical effort. There were no convenience stores, power tools, or machines to make things easier. Everything was manual. If you needed food, you grew it, hunted it, or slaughtered it. If you needed a home, you cut the logs, hauled the rocks, mixed the clay, and built it yourself. Farming wasn't done from a tractor, it was done with your back, your hands, and a mule if you were lucky. Men, women, and children all worked. Kids were expected to contribute as soon as they could walk. Women weren't just homemakers, they chopped wood, repaired fences, herded animals, and kept the family alive. Men often left for weeks or months at a time to find work, leaving the homestead to their wives and teenage sons. Nobody had time for rest. Sundays might bring a few hours of church or quiet, but the chores never truly stopped. This constant labor came at a cost. Most people were physically broken by their 40s, if they even made it that far. The average life expectancy in many Western settlements was just 35 years old. Not because people didn't want to live longer, but because their bodies simply gave out. Malnutrition, untreated injuries, exposure to the elements, and infections claimed lives quickly. What Hollywood shows as heroic endurance was often just desperation, exhaustion, and a lack of choice. Home wasn't sweet, it was a leaky shack or a hole in the ground. Think cozy cabin in the woods? Think again. Most frontier homes weren't charming log houses, they were slapped-together structures made from mud, straw, or roughly cut timber. Some families lived in dugouts, literally holes carved into hillsides and reinforced with sod. They were dark, damp, and freezing in winter. During storms, water leaked through the roof. In summer, they baked like ovens. Insulation was non-existent. Windows were often just holes covered with cloth or oiled paper. There were no screens, which meant insects poured in. Mosquitoes, flies, fleas, and lice were constant companions. Rattlesnakes slithered beneath floorboards. Tarantulas crawled across walls. Scorpions nested in shoes. You didn't sleep soundly in the Wild West. You slept with one eye open, hoping your blanket didn't hide a spider. Furniture was minimal, often handmade and uncomfortable. Floors were packed dirt or uneven boards. There was little space, less privacy, and zero soundproofing. Babies cried through the night. Chickens sometimes roamed indoors. Cooking smoke filled the air because chimneys didn't always work right. In some seasons, your only source of heat might be a poorly sealed stove burning cow dung. The psychological toll of such living conditions was immense. People cracked under the pressure, especially women trapped in isolated homes for months with no company beyond screaming children and howling winds. You wore what you had, and you wore it until it fell apart. In every Hollywood Western, cowboys wear crisp hats and clean vests, and the women are all in ruffled skirts with curled hair. That's pure fiction. Real frontier clothing was basic, coarse, and perpetually dirty. You wore the same few outfits all year, because that's all you had. Clothes were usually made of wool, canvas, or rough cotton, materials that could survive harsh use but weren't exactly comfortable. There was no fashion. No tailoring. No dry cleaning. People patched holes with whatever fabric they had, and often passed down clothes through multiple siblings. Undergarments? Maybe, maybe not. Socks? Often reused without washing. And laundry? Forget it. Washing clothes required hauling gallons of water, heating it over a fire, scrubbing by hand with lye soap, if available, then drying everything in the sun. It was an all-day ordeal. So most people didn't bother unless they absolutely had to. Clothes were worn until they were stiff with sweat, dirt, and grease. Bedding was just as bad, often never washed for months at a time. In winter, layers helped you stay warm but also trapped filth and fleas. In summer, there was no escape from sweat. Skin diseases, lice infestations, and rashes were just part of life. And while people didn't complain much, they had bigger problems. Discomfort was constant. So why did anyone stay? Looking back, it's hard to imagine why anyone would choose such a life. But for many, it wasn't a choice. Immigrants fleeing poverty, former slaves seeking land, single women escaping rigid Eastern society, all came west hoping for something better. What they found was unforgiving. Yet many stayed, endured, and built the foundations of towns that would one day become cities. The people of the Wild West weren't legends. They were survivors. And survival came with a cost: sweat, suffering, and a whole lot of dirt. You'd be hungry, sick, and tired, every single day. If sleeping in a bug-infested shack and never bathing weren't bad enough, wait until you hear what was on the menu in the Wild West. Spoiler alert, it wasn't steak and beans served around a cozy campfire. Frontier life wasn't just physically exhausting, it was nutritionally devastating. Between droughts, crop failures, and supply shortages, most people in the West lived on the edge of starvation. Hunger wasn't rare, it was a constant. People didn't eat to thrive, they ate just enough to survive. If you had 3 meals a day, you were lucky. If those meals had more than one ingredient, you were rich. The pioneer diet, bland, repetitive, and depressing. The average settler's food options were painfully limited. Most meals revolved around a few core staples: dried beans, cornmeal, flour, salt pork, hardtack, a rock-hard cracker, and maybe some lard or molasses. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare outside of growing season, and even then, unpredictable weather or insects could wipe out crops before harvest. Meat, when it was available, usually came from salted or smoked pork, jerky, or whatever wild game someone could shoot. In lean times, even that was a luxury. Chickens were more useful for eggs than for eating, and cows were more valuable alive for milk and labor than as dinner. Milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration, so most dairy came in the form of hard cheese, if any. Canned food was expensive and hard to find. Imported goods, like sugar, coffee, or rice, were even worse. They were hauled in by wagon or rail, and marked up so high that only saloon owners or wealthier families could afford them regularly. Spices? Forget about it. Food was boiled, fried in lard, or baked in crude ovens. If it had flavor, it was probably salt, or ashes. This diet didn't just get boring. It made people sick. Scurvy, the silent killer on the prairie. Today, we associate scurvy with pirates, but it was rampant on the western frontier. Caused by a lack of vitamin C, scurvy made gums bleed, teeth fall out, and wounds refuse to heal. It caused fatigue, depression, and eventually death. Settlers didn't understand the cause. There was no clear link yet between diet and disease. People just wasted away, assuming it was bad luck or consumption. Fresh fruits and vegetables were the only cure, but those were almost impossible to get in many parts of the West. Apples, berries, citrus, these didn't grow easily on the plains. And nobody was trucking in oranges to Deadwood or Tombstone. Some settlers tried to grow small gardens, but drought, frost, insects, and soil quality made even simple crops like carrots or onions difficult. Many relied on foraging, but wild edibles were seasonal and required knowledge that many newcomers didn't have. Native American tribes understood the land far better, but most settlers ignored or distrusted their knowledge. So people kept eating biscuits and beans, wondering why they felt weak, lost their hair, and couldn't fight off infection. Children were especially vulnerable. So were women during pregnancy. Scurvy didn't announce itself, it crept in, quiet and deadly. Coffee that could strip paint. Coffee was one of the most sought-after commodities in the Wild West, but if you're picturing a smooth, flavorful roast, lower your expectations. Beans were often old, stale, and roasted over open flames until they were nearly burnt. Settlers ground them by hand and boiled them directly in water, grounds and all, with no filter. The result was a bitter, sludge-like brew affectionately called cowboy coffee. Even worse, when real coffee beans weren't available, people used substitutes, roasted acorns, chicory, dried corn, even burnt bread. Some mixed in soot or wood ash to make it darker. Drinking it didn't give you a gentle caffeine buzz, it made you grimace. But in a world of physical labor and little sleep, caffeine was a necessity, no matter how foul the brew. Whiskey, on the other hand, was everywhere, and much easier to swallow. Malnutrition was normal. Without the nutrients needed to sustain a hard-working body, settlers aged fast and looked years older than they were. Many suffered from chronic fatigue, poor eyesight, muscle cramps, and brittle bones. Cuts took forever to heal. Women miscarried at alarming rates. Children were stunted and more likely to die from what we'd now consider minor infections. There was no such thing as a balanced diet. Carbs and fat were plentiful. Protein came in short bursts, after a successful hunt or slaughter, but was often preserved in ways that stripped out much of its nutrition. Vitamins and minerals? They weren't even part of the vocabulary yet. Some settlers raised pigs, chickens, or goats, but keeping them alive in harsh conditions wasn't easy. Predators, disease, and harsh winters wiped out entire flocks. Losing an animal could mean losing a month of meals. And when nature really turned on you, during droughts, floods, or locust swarms, there was nothing to fall back on. Starvation became a real, looming threat. Cooking meant creativity, or desperation. With limited ingredients and tools, settlers had to get creative. Cornmeal mush, pan-fried salt pork, lard biscuits, and bean stew were staples. Sometimes they baked sour milk bread using spoiled milk and soda. Pies might be made with dried apples soaked in water, or even green tomatoes pretending to be fruit. Children might eat gruel, watery porridge made from oats or cracked wheat. Adults often skipped meals so kids could have more. And during bad winters, entire communities pooled what little they had to make thin, watery soups that stretched out for days. Holidays were sometimes the only time people tasted sweetness, a rare molasses cake, a bit of candied fruit, or strong tea brewed from pine needles for a touch of vitamin C. These moments were cherished, but few and far between. There were no grocery stores, no freezers, no fast food joints. The pantry was what you could carry in a wagon, grow in dry soil, or trap in the woods. Cooking was a survival act, not a creative outlet. And eating was more about staying upright than enjoying the meal. Eating to survive, not to live. The truth about food in the Wild West is this: it didn't nourish, and it didn't comfort. It kept you alive, barely. Every bite was a reminder of the work still ahead, the crop you hoped would grow, or the long ride into town to buy another sack of beans. When people look back and say the pioneers were tough, it's not just about braving storms or fighting bandits. It's about going to bed with a half-empty stomach, waking up before dawn, and doing it all again, without ever tasting a ripe peach or a fresh salad. That's not grit. That's survival. Everything out there wanted to kill you, and often did. By now, you've survived a filthy shack, eaten little more than salted pork and sour biscuits, and trudged through your daily chores on 4 hours of sleep and 1 cup of bitter coffee. Unfortunately, you still wouldn't have made it through the week, because the West didn't just wear people down with work and hunger. It killed them. Suddenly. Violently. Randomly. Life on the frontier meant danger, real, immediate, often fatal. If the wind didn't blow your home away, the fever might take you. If the river didn't drown you, a rattlesnake might finish the job. And if you happened to escape all that, some drunken fool with a revolver might shoot you over a spilled drink. People in the Wild West didn't die old and peaceful in their beds. They died early, painfully, and often without warning. Nature was not your friend. Let's start with the weather. The western frontier wasn't just hot or cold. It was extreme. Blistering heat in the summer could dry your lips into cracked leather before breakfast. Winter storms rolled in like vengeance, dumping snow by the foot, trapping families indoors for weeks, sometimes killing livestock and people alike. Tornadoes and windstorms tore through settlements, ripping roofs off homes and hurling wagons like toys. Flash floods wiped out entire crops and people. Droughts could last months, ruining any hope of growing food or keeping animals alive. The land itself was unpredictable, merciless, and utterly indifferent to your suffering. Then there were the animals. Forget cute prairie dogs or majestic mustangs. Most creatures in the Wild West were armed, venomous, or hungry. Rattlesnakes slithered into boots and under bedrolls. A single bite, left untreated, could mean hours of agony followed by death. Scorpions and spiders hid in water barrels and clothing piles. Bears were known to raid camps for food. Wolves hunted livestock, and sometimes people, if they were desperate enough. Mountain lions stalked the high country. Even the more benign creatures, like ticks and mosquitoes, carried disease and drove people half mad with irritation. You were living in their territory. And they didn't care that you'd built a log cabin. Sickness spread like wildfire. Disease was as common as dust in a mining town, and far more dangerous. The towns and camps that popped up across the frontier weren't known for their sanitation. Outhouses sat dangerously close to wells. Garbage rotted in the open. Flies, rats, and fleas spread illness without discrimination. Cholera outbreaks could kill dozens in a matter of days. Typhoid and dysentery spread fast in summer, especially in crowded settlements where water was scarce and hygiene was an afterthought. Tuberculosis, called consumption at the time, slowly devoured its victims over months or years, leaving them coughing blood and wasting away. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, no understanding of germs. Fever was treated with whiskey. Open wounds were cleaned with dirty rags. Doctors, if available, could do little more than offer laudanum, an opiate syrup, and say a prayer. Worse still, some people just didn't believe in science. Diseases were often blamed on bad air, divine punishment, or moral weakness. As a result, preventive measures were rare. and treatments were often worse than the disease. If you survived the fever, the injury, or the infection, it was more luck than medicine. Violence was a daily threat, not a movie scene. Forget the Hollywood version of Western shootouts, two noble cowboys squaring off at high noon with honor on the line. That scene? Pure fantasy. In real life, violence was random, dirty, and often fueled by rage, liquor, or desperation. Bar fights, stabbings, and drunken brawls were routine. Gunfights rarely involved duels, they were more often ambushes, arguments gone wrong, or accidental discharges. People got shot over cheating at cards, borrowing a horse, or not paying their bar tab. And no one was really safe. Even women and children were caught in crossfire or hurt in family feuds. Weapons were not shiny six-shooters kept in polished holsters. Most settlers carried what they could afford, old hunting rifles, shotguns, or crude pistols. Many relied more on knives, axes, or fists. Ammunition was expensive and unreliable. Guns misfired. Powder got wet. Accidents happened constantly. Some towns attempted to regulate violence. Dodge City, Tombstone, and others actually had gun control laws. Visitors were required to check their weapons upon entering. But enforcement was spotty, and outside of town limits, no one was watching. If you crossed the wrong person in a remote area, the nearest lawman might be 50 miles away, and the prairie had plenty of places to bury a body. The law was a myth. Speaking of lawmen, they were few and far between. A single sheriff might be responsible for an area the size of Rhode Island, with no deputies and no real jail. Most justice was doled out by vigilantes, local men who formed posses or took matters into their own hands. These weren't heroes, they were often just as violent and lawless as the people they pursued. Lynching was shockingly common. Accusations didn't require proof. If someone was suspected of theft or murder, or if they were just disliked, they could find themselves dragged out of bed at night and hanged from the nearest tree. Justice was swift, brutal, and deeply flawed. Native Americans, Chinese laborers, black settlers, and Mexican ranchers were especially vulnerable. The law didn't protect them, it often ignored them completely. Violence against them rarely led to arrests. Their homes could be burned, their land stolen, and their lives taken without consequence. In the Wild West, who mattered less than who had the most friends with guns. Fear was part of everyday life. Pioneers didn't go to sleep dreaming of adventure. They went to sleep praying the wind wouldn't take their roof, that their child's cough wasn't the start of another deadly fever, and that no one would come riding into camp with a grudge and a rifle. They feared the sky. They feared the earth. They feared the stranger at the door. Everything about frontier life was fragile. You could build a home in spring and have it flooded by July. You could raise a barn in August and bury your wife in December. The line between surviving and vanishing was as thin as the canvas covering a wagon. The Wild West was not a place for the faint of heart. It was a place where danger wore many faces, weather, wildlife, disease, or your fellow man, and where safety was a luxury no one could afford. You're sick? Good luck. You're going to need it. Let's say you survived the rattlesnake bite. You avoided cholera in town and somehow weren't shot during that bar fight you accidentally stumbled into. Maybe you even managed to escape the winter storm with only a case of frostbite and a persistent cough. That's the good news. The bad news? Now you need a doctor. And that, in the Wild West, might have been the most dangerous part of all. Because if you were sick, injured, or giving birth in 1875, you were at the mercy of a medical system that was only marginally better than voodoo, and often just as deadly. Hospitals were almost non-existent. Sanitation was a joke. Pain relief was optional. And many so-called doctors had less training than a modern-day lifeguard. You didn't go to the doctor to get better. You went because you ran out of other options. Doctors weren't always doctors. The title doctor in the frontier era didn't necessarily mean what it does today. There were no national standards, no licensing boards, and no guarantees that your physician had ever even attended a medical school, much less completed a formal education. Many learned their trade through apprenticeship, trial and error, or mail-order diplomas. A few were barbers who picked up basic anatomy while cutting hair and removing boils. There were no regular checkups, no preventative care. You called a doctor when things were already bad, usually very bad, and hoped they didn't make it worse. In fact, one of the most dangerous things a person could do in the Old West was survive an injury and then let someone try to treat it. Surgery without anesthesia or sterilization. Imagine this: you're kicked by a horse. Your leg is broken. You've got a bone sticking out and an infection starting to set in. The local doctor examines you, declares the leg unsalvageable, and decides to amputate. There's no hospital, just your neighbor's kitchen table. No anesthesia, just a few shots of whiskey, or, if you're lucky, a whiff of chloroform, which could also kill you, by the way. There are no sterile instruments. The saw used to cut off your leg might have been used earlier that week to chop firewood or gut a deer. Antiseptics? Not in use. Germ theory wouldn't catch on for a few more decades, and many doctors still believed in miasmas, bad air, or imbalances of bodily humors as the source of illness. If you survived the amputation, which was far from guaranteed, the real threat came afterward: infection. Without antibiotics, a simple cut could become gangrenous. Sepsis could set in. Wounds weren't cleaned properly, and pus wasn't seen as a sign of infection. It was often considered a healthy part of the healing process. Many surgeries that should have saved lives ended up killing people faster than doing nothing at all. Treatments that made things worse. Let's say you had a fever, or maybe a persistent cough. Perhaps you'd been vomiting for a few days. A frontier doctor might treat this by bleeding you, literally cutting your vein open and draining blood to balance your fluids. Alternatively, they might prescribe mercury pills, arsenic tonics, or turpentine enemas. None of these treatments helped. Many actively harmed the patient, but they were widely used. If you were constipated, castor oil or calomel, a mercury compound, was often prescribed. If you were too thin, they might recommend pork fat. If you were too fat, perhaps vinegar. Fevers were treated with sweat lodges, opium tinctures, or mustard plasters. Earaches? Try pouring urine in the ear. Yes, really. Snake oil wasn't just a phrase, it was a literal product, often sold by traveling salesmen who claimed their bottled cure-all could treat everything from baldness to tuberculosis. These elixirs were mostly alcohol, laced with morphine, cocaine, or whatever else was lying around. People got addicted. People got poisoned. But the show went on. No help for women and children. If you were a woman in the Wild West, medical danger came with the territory, and it got worse the moment you became pregnant. Childbirth was terrifying. It often happened at home, attended by an older woman from town who may or may not have delivered a baby before. There were no ultrasounds, no prenatal vitamins, no concept of a sterile birthing environment. Tools, if any, were rudimentary: dirty scissors, rags, and a bucket of water. If the baby was breech, or the labor went long, both mother and child were often doomed. The maternal mortality rate was horrifyingly high. Hemorrhage, infection, and eclampsia, seizures caused by high blood pressure, were common killers. And if the mother survived, there was still a high chance her infant wouldn't. Babies died often. They died of diarrhea, malnutrition, pneumonia, or infection from the moment they were born. Vaccinations, even if available, were distrusted. Many infants never made it past the first few months. Women's health overall was barely studied or acknowledged. Menstrual pain, complications from childbirth, and conditions like hysteria were treated with isolation or, again, morphine. Many women became dependent on opiates just to function. And dentistry? That was a horror show all its own. Dentistry was torture. Toothaches were a common frontier problem. People lived on hard, salty food, often with no fresh produce. Vitamin deficiencies, particularly scurvy, from lack of vitamin C, rotted teeth. Sugar, though rare, was extremely harmful due to the lack of oral hygiene. Toothbrushes weren't common. Mouthwash wasn't a thing. You might swish whiskey or salt water, or just hope the pain went away. But often, it didn't. So you went to the local dentist, or blacksmith, or barber, or whoever happened to own a pair of forceps. There were no numbing agents. No Novocaine. The infected tooth was yanked out while you were held down and screamed into a rag. If the root broke or the jaw cracked, tough luck. Infection from dental procedures was common and often fatal. It's not surprising that many people simply lived with pain rather than risk the cure. Frontier medicine, a gamble with death. Medical care in the Wild West was a roulette wheel. For every doctor who tried their best, there were 10 who caused more harm than good. People died of things we consider trivial today: appendicitis, abscesses, even strep throat. Because without the tools of modern science, sterilization, anesthesia, antibiotics, imaging, every illness was a potential death sentence. So much of frontier life was about gambling. You gambled on the weather. You gambled on your crops. And if you got sick, you gambled on your doctor. The stakes? Your life. Lonely, broke, and forgotten. The emotional cost of frontier life. Let's say you've made it this far. You've survived the grueling manual labor, the unsanitary conditions, the venomous creatures, and the deeply underqualified frontier doctor. You've buried a friend or two. You've lost some teeth. You've dodged bullets, literally and metaphorically. And now, finally, you've carved out a small slice of survival. But what now? It turns out, surviving the Wild West wasn't just about staying alive. It was about staying sane, and that may have been the hardest part of all. Life on the frontier was brutally isolating. And it was expensive. You weren't just far from family or home, you were far from everything. Far from help. Far from community. Far from news. Far from anything resembling modern comfort. The West didn't just test your endurance, it tested your soul. Everything costs more when it comes by horse. Let's talk prices first. You might think life in the Wild West was simpler, maybe even cheaper. But the truth is that everything you needed to live, from coffee to nails, was wildly expensive. Why? Because nearly all of it had to be hauled in over hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles by wagon, horse, mule, or, if you were lucky, a slow, unreliable train. Imagine paying $1.50 for a pound of flour, when your daily wage was maybe $1. Or 5 cents for a single egg. Boots could cost $10 or more. That's over $300 today, and if your boots wore out, good luck getting another pair before winter. Imported goods, like sugar, fabric, tools, or books, were luxury items. Most people couldn't afford them. That meant you made do with rough cotton or burlap. You patched your clothes until they disintegrated. You reused every nail, every bit of string, every scrap of wood. Nothing was wasted, because everything was precious. And forget about medical supplies, soap, or kerosene. Those were town luxuries, and you weren't always near a town. The mail took weeks, if it arrived at all. Now imagine you're 500 miles from your parents, or your siblings, or the friends you grew up with. There's no phone. No email. No texting. The only way to hear from them, or let them know you're alive, is to send a handwritten letter and hope a stagecoach or mail rider makes it through. Mail was slow. Really slow. A letter from New York to Wyoming might take a month, or 2, or more, especially in winter, or during a flood, or if someone got robbed along the way. That meant communication with loved ones was like speaking across a void. If someone died, you might not find out for weeks. If you were ill or in trouble, help would arrive, if it arrived at all, long after you needed it. And newspapers? Forget breaking news. By the time a paper made it to your outpost, the information was often weeks out of date. You heard about presidential elections, natural disasters, or wars after they had happened. Sometimes long after. The result? You felt cut off from the world. Silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. There's a romantic image of the Western homestead, peaceful sunsets, wide open spaces, the quiet hum of the prairie wind. But in reality, that quiet could be crushing. Most homesteads were hours, or even days, from their nearest neighbor. During long winters or dry summers, you might not see another person outside your immediate family for weeks. The silence wasn't soothing, it was maddening. With no roads, no radio, and no town within walking distance, you could go days without hearing a human voice besides your own. This was especially brutal for women. A young woman brought out west by her husband might spend days completely alone while he hunted, worked a mine, or drove cattle. She cooked, hauled water, kept the fire going, sewed clothes, milked animals, and sometimes gave birth entirely alone. Loneliness wasn't just emotional, it was physical. Even when you did see other people, you couldn't always talk freely. Privacy was non-existent in small towns, and reputations were fragile. If you were struggling, you often kept it to yourself. And the result of all this emotional pressure? People broke. The mental health crisis no one talked about. Frontier life took a deep toll on the human psyche. Depression was common, but it wasn't recognized as a medical condition. It was seen as weakness, or laziness, or a woman's complaint. Anxiety, panic attacks, postpartum depression, and PTSD, often suffered by veterans and settlers alike, went entirely untreated. People drank a lot. Alcohol was one of the few available medicines on the frontier, and it was used for everything from pain relief to emotional numbness. Whiskey was cheap, strong, and always available at the saloon. And it wasn't just men. Women drank, too, sometimes secretly, sometimes out of desperation. But alcohol made things worse. It fueled violence. It destroyed families. And it worsened the loneliness it was supposed to cure. Many settlers fell into long periods of despair. Some became reclusive. Others violent. And tragically, some ended their own lives. Suicide, especially among isolated ranchers and homesteaders, was not uncommon. There were no crisis hotlines, no therapists, no support systems. If you couldn't carry the weight, you simply collapsed under it. Hope was scarce, but not dead. And yet, people stayed. They endured. Not because it was beautiful, but because they believed things could get better. Some towns formed reading clubs. A traveling preacher might double as a newsreader. Women formed quilting circles to share stories and food. Men gathered for barn raisings, or poker games, or music around a fire. The rare letter from home was read aloud until it nearly disintegrated from use. Some folks wrote in journals, not because they expected anyone to read them, but because writing was the only way to keep the loneliness at bay. And slowly, railroads expanded. Towns grew. Telegraphs connected cities. News came faster. Goods got cheaper. But those early decades? Those were years of silence and scarcity, and only the most emotionally resilient people survived them intact. Living in the Wild West wasn't just physically brutal. It was spiritually crushing. It's easy to picture cowboys and pioneers as rugged, stoic heroes. But the truth is that many were exhausted, overworked, and emotionally wrecked. They were people who had left everything they knew behind in search of opportunity, only to find themselves isolated, broke, and utterly alone on a horizon that never seemed to end. Survival in the West wasn't just about keeping your body alive. It was about keeping your hope alive. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest challenge of all. No job was safe. The West was built on dangerous labor. By now, you've survived the stink, the storms, the silence, the violence, and the slow mental erosion of frontier life. So what's next? Work. Because in the Wild West, not working wasn't an option. Everyone worked hard. And yet no job guaranteed safety, stability, or even a steady income. Many of them could, and did, kill you. There was no OSHA. No unions. No worker protections. If you lost a hand in an accident, you didn't get compensation, you just had one less hand. If you died, someone else took your job the next day. That's how it was. The West didn't just break spirits. It broke bodies. Let's look at the most common, and most hazardous, jobs on the frontier, and why you probably wouldn't survive any of them. 1. Mining. Dark, deadly, and dusty. It's no surprise that mining was one of the most dangerous occupations in the West. Lured by the promise of gold, silver, and copper, thousands of men, and some women, rushed to mining towns hoping to strike it rich. Most didn't. Instead of hitting the jackpot, miners found themselves working long shifts in narrow, airless shafts. They used hand tools and crude dynamite in tunnels barely high enough to crawl through. Collapses were frequent. A wrongly placed charge or an unstable timber could bury a dozen men alive in seconds. Even if the cave didn't fall in, the air might kill you. Dust from drilling and blasting filled your lungs. After months or years of inhaling fine particles, you developed miner's lung, a chronic, irreversible condition that made it hard to breathe. Many miners coughed themselves to death before the age of 40. Then there was toxic gas. Methane, carbon monoxide, sulfur fumes, all invisible, all deadly. Some miners carried canaries into tunnels, hoping the bird would die before they did. Sometimes, it didn't die fast enough. And let's not forget the pay, irregular, often delayed, and sometimes paid in scrip only usable at overpriced company stores. If you didn't die in the mine, you died in debt too. Cowboys, not all hats and horses. Let's debunk the myth now. Being a cowboy was not romantic. It was not glamorous. It was grueling. Most cowboys weren't white gunslingers in shiny hats. They were poor young men, often Mexican, Black, or Native American, working from dawn till nightfall herding thousands of cattle across hundreds of miles. Cattle drives took weeks. You slept on the ground in all weather, burning sun, pouring rain, freezing nights. Your meals were usually beans, bacon, and stale biscuits. You rode for 12 to 16 hours a day, and every day brought new risks, stampedes, river crossings, snake bites, or getting crushed by a steer. And then there were the horses. You didn't get a well-trained, calm companion. You got whatever horse was available, sometimes wild, often temperamental. A single bad throw could leave you with broken ribs or a crushed skull. Pay was low. Injury was common. And cowboys were often laid off once the herding season ended. You were hired muscle, not a hero. And if you thought you'd retire with dignity, forget it. Most cowboys didn't make it past 35. 3. Farmers, battling earth, weather, and bugs. If mining and cowboying seemed too chaotic, maybe you'd try farming. Plant a little wheat, build a little cabin, live off the land. Sounds peaceful, right? It wasn't. Farming in the West meant starting from scratch. You were often given a patch of wilderness and told to make it work. That meant clearing trees, digging a well, plowing hard-packed soil with oxen or a muley, assuming you could afford either. And the land fought back. Droughts lasted months. Dust storms ruined topsoil. Hailstorms could shred an entire harvest in minutes. And then came the grasshoppers. Swarms of locusts, sometimes billions strong, descended like black clouds. They devoured crops, cloth, wood, and even paint from wagons. Entire families watched their year's food vanish in an hour. Disease also ran rampant. With little access to medicine or clean water, farmers and their families fell prey to dysentery, malaria, and typhoid. Kids died young. Pregnancies were dangerous. And winters were harsh, especially in remote areas where help was days away. Worst of all, the isolation. Many farmers went months without seeing neighbors. The silence of the prairie drove some to madness. And yet they worked every day, sun up to sundown, because one bad season could mean starvation. 4. Hired hands, factory work, railroads, and child labor. Not everyone had land. Not everyone herded cattle. Many people, especially new immigrants, worked for whatever wage they could get. Often, that meant jobs no one else wanted. Factories popped up across western towns, making everything from tools to flour. But these weren't clean, modern plants. They were loud, hot, cramped, and dangerously understaffed. Guards were few. Belts and gears were exposed. One slip of the hand, and your fingers were gone. Sometimes your arm. Railroad work was even worse. Tens of thousands of Chinese, Irish, and African American laborers laid track through mountains, deserts, and frozen plains. They blasted through rock using black powder and nitroglycerin, often with no protective gear. Cave-ins, explosions, and falling debris killed hundreds. Workers slept in tents. They ate poorly. They were paid less than white workers and treated as disposable. Injured? You were fired. Dead? Replaced. And then, yes, then, there were the children. Child labor was rampant in the West. Kids as young as 8 worked in factories, farms, and even mines. They hauled coal, operated machinery, and cleaned dangerous equipment. There were no school requirements. No safety standards. No future beyond survival. If you were poor in the Wild West, your childhood ended early, and often painfully. You didn't choose a career. You chose a survival strategy. In the modern world, we talk about career paths, work-life balance, and job satisfaction. In the Wild West, your job was whatever kept you from starving that month. There were no guarantees. No pensions. No retirement. The strongest survived. The rest were buried in shallow graves. Jobs in the West weren't about passion or fulfillment. They were about enduring hardship with the slim hope that maybe, just maybe, the next harvest would be better, or that the mine wouldn't collapse, or that the cough in your lungs wasn't fatal. And every day, thousands of people went back to work, because they had no other choice. Hard roads, harsh rides, why travel in the Wild West was a gamble with death. After hearing about the brutal jobs, unbearable living conditions, lack of hygiene, and ever-present threat of violence in the Wild West, you might think, well, at least people could move. Leave town. Start fresh. But here's the hard truth, travel wasn't a solution. It was a whole new problem. In modern times, you can book a flight, hop on a highway, or catch a train to just about anywhere in relative comfort. But in the 1800s, especially in the American frontier, going somewhere was a calculated risk, a slow, uncomfortable, dangerous journey that might leave you broken, or buried. From overpriced rail tickets to bone-jarring stagecoach rides to treacherous treks across unforgiving landscapes, movement in the West wasn't mobility, it was survival on wheels, or feet. Let's break down what it really meant to try and get from one place to another in the Wild West. 1. The illusion of the railroad, expensive, elite, and incomplete. The railroad changed America, but not for everyone, and not right away. While railroads expanded rapidly after the Civil War, tracks didn't cover the entire West until late in the 19th century. The idea that you could ride a train into the heart of the wilderness was more fiction than fact for much of the frontier period. Even when rail service was available, it wasn't accessible to most people. Tickets were expensive, especially for long trips. A ride from the East Coast to the West could cost the equivalent of several weeks, or months, of wages. Poor homesteaders, cowboys, miners, and itinerant workers simply couldn't afford that. And forget comfort. Unless you could spring for a first-class cabin, rare, you were packed into tight, unheated wooden cars. In winter, that meant freezing. In summer, you baked in your own sweat. The seats were hard, the windows were drafty, and the ride was often rough due to poorly maintained tracks. Accidents were also common. Trains derailed. Bridges collapsed. Boilers exploded. Bandits occasionally robbed passengers mid-route. There was no guarantee you'd arrive at your destination in one piece, or at all. So while the railroad looked like progress, for many, it was just another danger-filled option they couldn't afford. 2. Stagecoaches, bone-rattling, wheel-breaking ordeals. When trains weren't an option, and they often weren't, people turned to the legendary stagecoach. Let's erase any romantic notions you may have. A stagecoach ride wasn't scenic or charming. It was loud, dusty, and agonizingly slow. Imagine riding in a cramped wooden box with no suspension across miles of uneven terrain. The coach bounced, rattled, and jolted so much that passengers often bruised their backs, hips, and heads just trying to stay upright. Some vomited from motion sickness. Others developed sores from hours of sitting still. Breakdowns were frequent. Wooden wheels snapped. Axles cracked. If a horse went lame or a river flooded, your trip could be delayed by days, or cancelled altogether. And then there were bandits. Roads were isolated. Law enforcement was minimal. Highwaymen often ambushed stagecoaches looking for cash, weapons, or supplies. If you were lucky, they just took your belongings. If you weren't, they left you injured, or dead, on the side of the road. And yet, this was one of the better options available. 3. Walking, slow, dangerous, and soul-crushing. If you couldn't afford a train ticket and there was no stagecoach available, or you simply didn't trust either, you walked. Yes, walked. Many westbound settlers and seasonal workers traveled hundreds of miles on foot, carrying their few possessions on their backs or pushing them in crude carts. The terrain was unforgiving. You faced rocky paths, thorny brush, wide rivers, swamps, and desert stretches with no shade or water. Shoes wore out. Feet blistered. legs cramped. The sun burned your skin by day and the cold stiffened your joints at night. But physical discomfort was only part of the suffering. There were wild animals, wolves, mountain lions, bears. There were snakes and scorpions. There were bandits, hostile strangers, and long stretches of silence that broke your spirit. You ate what you could hunt or carry. You drank whatever water you found, often tainted or stagnant. And if you got injured or sick, you had to keep moving or be left behind. Walking might have been free, but it came at a steep cost. 4. The Oregon Trail, hope, horror, and high death tolls. Perhaps no journey better encapsulates the hardship of westward travel than the legendary Oregon Trail. Between the 1830s and 1860s, tens of thousands of families set off from Missouri hoping to reach Oregon, California, or Utah. Some made it. Many didn't. It was roughly 2,000 miles of brutal terrain. Wagons were heavy, wooden, and broke often. Roads weren't paved, they were rutted, muddy, and at times disappeared entirely. You had to ford rivers, cross mountain passes, and endure every weather extreme imaginable. Storms destroyed wagons. Rains caused flash floods. Droughts dried up water sources for weeks. Snow trapped parties in high passes, sometimes leading to starvation and death. Then came the diseases. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, these were rampant. Poor sanitation meant people defecated near campsites or rivers, spreading illness. Entire wagon parties were wiped out by disease in just days. 1 out of 10 travelers died on the trail. And mental exhaustion was just as devastating. The sheer monotony of the journey, weeks without seeing anything but open plains or mountains, broke people down. Families argued. People lost hope. Some wandered off and were never seen again. Suicides, especially among women, were tragically common. The trail wasn't an adventure. It was a test of human endurance, and a gamble few could afford to lose. 5. Isolation and the psychological toll of movement. What made travel in the Wild West so dangerous wasn't just physical danger, it was mental wear. Distances were vast. Messages traveled slowly. There were no cell phones, no GPS, no gas stations, and no guarantees. Every trip was a departure into the unknown. And if you were traveling alone, the isolation could eat away at you. People talked to their horses. Others kept journals they never intended to share, just to preserve their sense of identity. And many simply gave up mid-journey, settling in the nearest town or shack and trying to make the best of where they landed. When moving forward feels more dangerous than standing still, most people stand still. That's what made the Wild West so difficult. It didn't just challenge your body. It wore down your hope. You didn't travel. You risked everything. In the end, travel in the Wild West wasn't about leisure or freedom, it was about necessity and danger. Whether you were chasing land, escaping debt, following gold, or reuniting with family, every journey westward carried enormous risks. Your wagon might break. Your horse might die. You might get sick, starve, or simply lose the will to go on. And yet people traveled. Because hope is powerful, even in a world built to crush it. But would you survive that kind of journey? Probably not. And that's why the Wild West is better left to boring bedtime history than real-life experience. The ugly truth, racism and ethnic conflict in the Wild West. If you've followed this far, you've probably realized the Wild West was no glamorous playground. It was dusty, dangerous, and downright deadly. But we've saved one of the most difficult truths for last, one that Hollywood often ignores: life in the Wild West was deeply unequal. For people of color and immigrants, it was worse than hard. It was brutal, hostile, and often dehumanizing. While the image of the frontier is often painted in shades of grit and glory, that canvas was also soaked in prejudice, exclusion, and racial violence. It's time to talk about the people who built the West but rarely made it into the history books. 1. A diverse West, but not an equal one. Despite its harshness, the American frontier attracted a wide array of people. The Wild West wasn't just made up of white settlers and gun-toting sheriffs. It was far more diverse than that. You had Chinese immigrants, who came in waves during the 1850s and 1860s, especially during the gold rush and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. There were Mexican Americans, some who lived in the region before it even became part of the United States. African Americans, both formerly enslaved and free, moved west for opportunity and escape from the Jim Crow South. And then there were European immigrants, Germans, Irish, Scandinavians, each group with its own hardships and social obstacles. But diversity didn't mean equality. 2. The Chinese experience: exploitation, exclusion, and violence. The Chinese laborers who helped build the railroads, especially the Central Pacific Line through the Sierra Nevada, were essential to the West's growth. Yet they were grossly underpaid, given the most dangerous jobs, and subjected to extreme racism. While white workers might earn $30 a month plus meals and housing, Chinese workers earned closer to $20 with no benefits, and were often charged for food and shelter. They were expected to blast through mountains with outdated explosives, often dying in rockslides and tunnel collapses. When they protested or went on strike, their camps were cut off from supplies until they relented. Even after the railroads were complete, anti-Chinese sentiment didn't fade, it got worse. In towns like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Rock Springs, violent mobs attacked Chinese communities, looted businesses, and murdered civilians in cold blood. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major federal immigration restriction, was a direct response to this hysteria, effectively banning Chinese labor immigration for decades. Many Chinese men ended up trapped in poverty, unable to bring their families over their own land. Others lived in underground Chinatowns to avoid harassment. They built the infrastructure of the West, and were repaid with fear, hate, and systemic erasure. 3. Mexican Americans, from landowners to outsiders. Before the U.S. annexed the Southwest following the Mexican-American War, much of what's now California, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico was part of Mexico. Thousands of Mexican families had owned ranches, farms, and towns for generations. But after 1848, they found themselves foreigners in their own homeland. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo promised to protect their property rights, but in practice, this rarely happened. Through legal loopholes, fraudulent land claims, and outright intimidation, white settlers and speculators seized massive amounts of land. Many Mexican Americans were pushed off their ancestral lands and forced into low-wage labor as farmhands, cowboys, or domestic workers. Some resisted, leading to confrontations like the Las Garras Blancas movement in New Mexico, but they were branded as outlaws and violently suppressed. In everyday life, they faced discrimination in schools, housing, and employment. Signs reading "No Mexicans Allowed" were common in public businesses. Even speaking Spanish could provoke arrest or assault. And in court? Good luck. Mexican Americans were often denied the right to testify against whites or serve on juries. Justice was anything but blind. 4. African Americans, new freedom, old chains. After the Civil War, many freed African Americans looked westward with hope. Some became exodusters and settled in Kansas or Oklahoma, building black farming communities. Others took jobs as cowhands, miners, and soldiers, often with more opportunity than in the postbellum South. But racism didn't stop at the Mississippi River. African Americans were routinely paid less than white laborers and given the worst jobs: dangerous, dirty, and unstable. Those who succeeded economically were often targeted for violence or pushed out by discriminatory laws. Despite their contributions, especially as Buffalo Soldiers, the black regiments of the U.S. Army, they were rarely recognized. Even in military service, they endured inferior supplies, degrading treatment, and limited advancement. In towns, they faced segregation, curfews, and vigilante justice. In lawless areas, being black could be enough to get you jailed, or lynched, without cause. There were no safe spaces. No guarantees. And yet, despite it all, African Americans played a vital role in taming the frontier. They carved out spaces of freedom, culture, and resistance in a hostile land. 5. Native Americans, the erased majority. While not part of the original outline, no discussion of race in the West is complete without acknowledging the people who were here long before manifest destiny was even an idea: Native Americans. Entire tribes were forcibly removed, starved, or slaughtered to make room for settlers. Their lands were seized, treaties broken, and cultures criminalized. From the Trail of Tears to the Wounded Knee Massacre, the Western expansion was as much a story of conquest as it was of progress. While the U.S. government waged wars to take land, settlers often took part in local massacres, scalp bounties, and ethnic cleansing campaigns. Native children were sent to boarding schools where they were stripped of language, hair, and identity in an attempt to civilize them. So when we talk about the Wild West being lawless, that lawlessness was often state-sponsored, especially when it came to indigenous lives. 6. European immigrants, not white enough, yet. Even white immigrants weren't immune from prejudice. At first, Irish immigrants were mocked as lazy, drunk, and subhuman. Germans were distrusted for speaking a foreign language. Scandinavians were viewed as odd and overly religious. Italians and Eastern Europeans were often lumped together as criminals or anarchists. They faced violence, wage suppression, and exclusion, but over time, most were able to become white in the eyes of society. They climbed the ladder others weren't allowed to touch. But for Black, Chinese, Mexican, and Native people, the bottom rungs were cut off entirely. 7. The myth of the melting pot. We like to imagine the frontier as a rough-and-ready democracy where everyone pulled their weight. But the reality was that the West was just as segregated and divided as the East, if not more so. There were separate neighborhoods, unequal wages, restricted rights, and mob justice. For many non-white communities, survival in the West meant staying invisible or living on the margins. While some individuals found success, the systems were stacked against them. And often, their contributions were forgotten, their suffering erased. The frontier wasn't fair, it was brutal. When you think of the Wild West, it's easy to picture grit, dust, and danger. But beyond the gunfights and saloons was a society where racism was not just a social ill, it was policy, practice, and everyday reality. The story of the American frontier is not complete without acknowledging those who were exploited, excluded, and erased. They helped build the railroads, towns, and economies that shaped the nation, and paid the highest price for it. So no, you probably wouldn't survive a day in the Wild West, especially not if you weren't white. The tragedy of Native Americans. By now, the glossy myths of the Wild West have been peeled away. We've looked behind the curtain of Hollywood fantasy and found a place soaked in dust, blood, labor, loneliness, and deep injustice. But no retelling of frontier life is complete, nor honest, without addressing the greatest tragedy of all, the systematic destruction of Native American life. Long before any cowboy saddled up or railroad stake was driven into the earth, the Great Plains, deserts, forests, and rivers were home to thriving native nations. These communities had rich languages, spiritual traditions, governments, and trade networks that stretched across the continent. What followed over the course of the 19th century was not simply displacement, it was a cultural, economic, and demographic collapse fueled by war, disease, starvation, and forced assimilation. Let's not sugarcoat it. For Native Americans, the so-called taming of the West was nothing short of a catastrophe. 1. Population collapse and the path to reservations. At the time of European contact, millions of indigenous people lived across North America. By the mid-1800s, their numbers had plummeted. War, smallpox, measles, and starvation devastated entire nations. When settlers pushed westward, fueled by the ideology of manifest destiny, they brought more than rifles and fences. They brought the end of a way of life. As U.S. expansion continued, Native communities were either wiped out in battles, relocated through forced treaties, or pushed onto reservations, often in barren or unwanted lands far from their original territories. These reservations were framed as a solution by the U.S. government, but in practice they were open-air prisons. Tribes who once roamed the plains freely were suddenly confined to narrow strips of territory, dependent on government-issued food, often spoiled or insufficient. Many starved. Diseases swept through reservation camps. Traditional governments were undermined or ignored. Sovereignty became a shadow of its former self. 2. The extermination of the buffalo, killing a way of life. One of the most devastating blows to native communities on the plains was the targeted extermination of the American bison, the buffalo. Bison were not just a food source. They were central to spiritual life, economy, and mobility for plains tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche. From hides to bones to meat, every part of the animal was used with purpose. The buffalo were sacred. But to U.S. military and political leaders, the bison were seen as a tool of resistance. Kill the buffalo, and you kill the ability of tribes to live independently. This was not accidental, it was policy. Professional hunters, many employed by the government or railroad companies, slaughtered millions of buffalo in a matter of decades. Often, the carcasses were left to rot. Photographs from the time show mountains of bison skulls being stacked for industrial processing, grisly symbols of ecological and cultural genocide. By the 1880s, bison herds had gone from tens of millions to mere hundreds. And with them, the ability of native people to feed their families, travel with seasons, and maintain traditions tied to the land. 3. The boarding school era. Cultural erasure in the name of civilization. Perhaps the most haunting chapter in the frontier's legacy is what happened to Native American children. Starting in the late 19th century, U.S. policy shifted from violent conquest to something seen as more humane but equally destructive: assimilation. The goal was not just to relocate native peoples, but to erase their cultures altogether. And the chosen battleground was the mind of the child. Native children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to government-run or church-run boarding schools, often thousands of miles away. At these institutions, places like Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, students were forbidden from speaking their native languages, wearing traditional clothing, or practicing their religions. Their hair was cut. Their names were replaced with English ones. They were often beaten for speaking their tribal tongue, and punished with isolation or hard labor. The motto of these schools was chillingly blunt: kill the Indian, save the man. Students were taught to be ashamed of their identity, history, and family. Many never returned home. Some died of disease or abuse in these institutions, their graves unmarked or hidden. Others returned, unable to reconnect with the communities they had been torn from. The trauma didn't end there. Generations of native families were affected, parents lost children, languages withered, and spiritual continuity was shattered. These scars remain today. 4. Resistance, survival, and silence. Despite every attempt to erase them, native peoples resisted, through war, through negotiation, through quiet preservation of culture in secret and in exile. Figures like Sitting Bull, Geronimo, and Chief Joseph tried to protect their people, their lands, and their dignity. Some led direct military resistance. Others chose legal battles. Some chose prayer, song, and oral storytelling as a means of survival. But the broader American public, intoxicated by ideas of progress and profit, largely turned a blind eye. Native suffering was seen as inevitable, or worse, deserved. Frontier newspapers often portrayed native communities as savages standing in the way of civilization. Even well-meaning settlers could not see beyond their own ambitions. This denial, this silence, allowed a tragedy to continue long after the last cavalry charge. Generations grew up believing the West had been empty, waiting to be claimed. 5. A reckoning with the myth. If the Wild West was a place of freedom, it was not freedom for all. For Native Americans, it was a landscape of loss. Loss of land, family, language, and self. Not by accident, not as a byproduct, but as a deliberate strategy of expansion. Genocide doesn't always come with a clear declaration. Sometimes, it's done with treaties, trains, and textbooks. And yet, Native people endure. Despite every attempt to erase them, indigenous nations across the U.S. have survived and continue to fight for their rights, languages, land, and cultures. The legacy of resistance lives on in courtrooms, in powwows, in ceremonies held in secret and in pride. Still, when we tell the story of the West without them, or worse, as villains in a settler's tale, we continue the erasure. The frontier was never empty. The final truth of the Wild West is this: it was never wild, never empty, and never waiting to be discovered. It was already home, stolen from people who loved, honored, and understood the land better than any settler ever could. We cannot talk about the challenges of frontier life without acknowledging the deepest wound of all: what was taken from Native Americans, and what was never truly returned. If you think you wouldn't survive a day in the Wild West, imagine being born into a world where your culture is hunted, your food supply is slaughtered, your language forbidden, and your history denied. That was daily life for Native Americans. And for many, the struggle continues. Women in the struggle for survival and autonomy. In the rugged mythology of the American frontier, women are often painted into the background: damsels in distress, saloon girls with hearts of gold, or stoic wives waiting by the hearth. But the truth of life for women in the Wild West was far more complex, far less glamorous, and often brutally difficult. If you think life on the frontier was hard for men, it was doubly so for women. They were expected to work like men, care like mothers, endure like saints, and defend like soldiers. They faced unique dangers, physical, emotional, and social, that rarely appear in Hollywood retellings. The West didn't offer them freedom in the romantic sense. It offered work, risk, and occasionally, a sliver of unexpected agency, but always at a cost. Let's strip away the last of the romantic illusions and look at the harsh reality of women in the American West. 1. Work without end, labor in all directions. The average frontier woman was not sitting idly inside a cozy log cabin baking pies. She was laboring from dawn until nightfall, and the line between women's work and men's work blurred quickly when survival was on the line. These women plowed fields, planted crops, and harvested in the sun, milked cows, fed livestock, and repaired fences, cooked every meal, churned butter, and baked bread in wood-fired stoves, sewed clothes by hand, made soap from animal fat, and preserved food for brutal winters, tended to children, elderly relatives, and any injured neighbors, loaded guns and stood guard when danger came knocking, whether from wild animals, outlaws, or invading soldiers. In essence, they were farmers, caretakers, teachers, medics, and defenders, all rolled into one. And still, their labor was often invisible or taken for granted by both society and history. The idea that men built the West ignores the aching backs, bloodied hands, and iron will of the women who built it beside them, and sometimes, without them. 2. Isolation and widowhood, the loneliest job on earth. Death was common on the frontier. Disease, accidents, violence, and childbirth claimed lives regularly. Many women became widows at a young age, often with children to raise and no community to support them. Widowhood wasn't just an emotional loss, it was often an economic and physical crisis. With no male legal representation in a patriarchal system, widows could lose land, homes, and any social standing. Those who survived did so by becoming resourceful, tough, and self-reliant, or by remarrying out of necessity rather than love. And even without death, life was isolating. Many homesteads were miles apart. A woman could go weeks without seeing another adult, aside from her husband or children. In the winter months, especially, isolation contributed to depression, anxiety, and mental breakdowns, conditions poorly understood and often dismissed as female hysteria. There were no therapists, no support groups, just a vast horizon and the endless echo of silence. 3. The harsh reality of sex work. In towns with booming mines or railroads, where men vastly outnumbered women, prostitution became a common and sometimes necessary profession. Women often turned to sex work out of economic desperation, especially if they were orphaned, widowed, or abandoned. Contrary to the glamorized saloon girls of Western films, the reality was grim. Most prostitutes lived in poverty, with little control over their earnings. Many suffered from abuse, addiction, disease, and social scorn. Some were trafficked, coerced, or trapped in the trade by brothel owners or violent men. Working conditions were unsanitary, dangerous, and isolating. A few managed to save money, escape the trade, or open businesses of their own. These rare stories are often cherry-picked to romanticize the role of prostitutes in the West, but they were the exception, not the rule. For most women in the trade, it was a life of sorrow and survival, not freedom or fame. 4. Unlikely avenues of empowerment. And yet, Paradoxically, the scarcity of women in the West also created unexpected opportunities for agency and autonomy. In towns where women were few, their presence became a highly valued social currency. This imbalance sometimes gave women better marriage prospects, at least in choice, if not always quality. Land ownership rights under certain homesteading laws, economic power as business owners, innkeepers, or traders, and, most surprisingly, early political rights. Wyoming, for instance, became the first U.S. territory to grant women the right to vote, in 1869. Not necessarily because of feminist ideals, but because it was seen as a way to attract female settlers and project a progressive image. Other territories followed, like Utah and Colorado, well before national suffrage passed in 1920. While most women still lacked meaningful legal power, these early cracks in the patriarchal structure were forged out of necessity, not revolution. Still, the idea that women in the West enjoyed equal rights is an exaggeration. These were small, uneven gains, often tied to geography and male political calculations, not broad systemic change. 5. Gender, violence, and the constant threat. Life on the frontier came with constant risk of violence, and women were not spared. Rape, domestic abuse, and exploitation were widespread and largely ignored by authorities, when authorities even existed. Law enforcement was often minimal or corrupt, and women who reported abuse were frequently blamed or dismissed. Marriage was not always a shield. Some women were sold into marriage or treated as property. Others endured abandonment or betrayal, with no legal recourse or financial protection. Weapons became part of women's lives, guns hidden under aprons, knives tucked into boots. Some women became legendary for their ferocity and independence, like Calamity Jane or Annie Oakley, but they were outliers in a system designed to trap women in roles of silent suffering. 6. Teaching, midwifery, and the quiet heroes. Not all women wielded guns or plowed fields. Some took on essential, quieter roles that held communities together. Teaching and midwifery. Female teachers were often young, unmarried, and sent to remote towns where education was minimal. They lived with host families, made meager wages, and juggled classrooms of all ages, often with no supplies. Still, they educated generations who would otherwise have gone without schooling. Midwives, meanwhile, were lifesavers in places where doctors were scarce. They delivered babies, treated wounds, and provided basic medical care. In many ways, they were the frontier's unofficial nurses, doctors, and therapists, often with no formal training, just experience and intuition. Their names are largely forgotten, but their legacy is written in every life they helped bring safely into the world. 7. The women of the West were warriors in their own right. In the end, women in the Wild West were not passive background figures. They were the quiet backbone, the exhausted heart, and sometimes the overlooked heroes of frontier survival. They endured childbirth without anesthesia, worked fields with broken backs, outlived husbands, buried children, and still found the strength to cook breakfast the next morning. They raised families in the dust, stood guard with rifles, prayed over graves, and sometimes dared to hope that the next generation might inherit something better. And yes, they were sometimes given more voice, more power, and more choice than their counterparts back east, but only because no one else was there to do the work. The West wasn't a place of freedom for women. It was a place of grit, danger, exhaustion, and survival. Against the odds, they shaped the frontier as much as any cowboy or cattle baron, though their names rarely make the textbooks. So next time you picture the Wild West, don't just imagine the saloon shootout or the stagecoach robbery. Picture the woman alone in a one-room cabin, boiling laundry over a fire, rifle at her side, baby crying, storm clouds gathering. That was the real West. Weak law and order, the myth of frontier justice. By now, if you've journeyed through all the previous parts of this series, you know the American West wasn't the swashbuckling adventure land that movies promised. It wasn't all duels at high noon or lone sheriffs keeping peace with nothing but a revolver and a square jaw. In fact, if you found yourself in trouble out west, you'd probably be on your own, or worse, at the mercy of mob justice, drunken violence, or corrupt figures hiding behind tin stars. Let's talk about the Wild West's shaky relationship with law and order, and why justice, when it came, was rarely swift, fair, or even legal. 1. The sheriff was one man against the wild. The image of the town sheriff is iconic: tall hat, leather boots, a shiny badge. In reality, sheriffs in the Old West were often overworked, underpaid, and grossly outnumbered. Most were elected by local communities, and they were expected to maintain peace across hundreds of square miles, track down outlaws across mountains, forests, and deserts, act as judge, jury, and jailer in isolated towns, handle everything from theft and brawls to murders and land disputes. But they weren't superheroes. They were often regular citizens with limited training, limited resources, and no real backup. Many counties didn't even have official jails. Arresting someone meant locking them in a barn, a cellar, or chaining them to a post until the circuit judge showed up, which might take months. Imagine trying to enforce the law in a place where news traveled slower than horses, supplies were weeks away, and everyone was armed. Good sheriffs burned out fast. Others turned corrupt, overwhelmed by pressure or bribed by the very criminals they were supposed to stop. 2. The rise of vigilantes and lynch mobs. In towns where law enforcement was too slow or too soft, or simply didn't exist, people took justice into their own hands. These were the vigilantes, self-deputized enforcers who claimed to act in the name of justice but often delivered chaos instead. Some communities formed vigilance committees to punish rustlers, outlaws, and troublemakers. At first, these groups had public support. But without legal boundaries, vigilantism turned into mob rule. People were dragged from homes or jail cells in the middle of the night, hung from trees without trial, branded, beaten, or banished for offenses ranging from real crimes to personal grudges, denied any defense, evidence, or appeal. What began as an attempt to protect the community quickly morphed into revenge killings, racial terror, and power grabs. In some towns, vigilantes became more feared than the criminals they claimed to fight. They answered to no one, not judges, not juries, and certainly not the accused. 3. Justice depended on where you were, and who you were. One of the most dangerous truths about the West was that justice wasn't consistent. It depended heavily on location. Distant towns had no regular judges or courts. Race and class: white men often received lighter treatment, while people of color faced harsh and immediate punishment. Connections: if you were related to a landowner, politician, or local boss, chances were you could dodge the worst consequences. Chinese laborers, black settlers, Mexican farmers, and Native Americans were often punished more severely, or without cause. False accusations could quickly become death sentences, and trials, if they occurred, were more about appearances than fairness. And if you thought being innocent would protect you, think again. Innocent people were hanged by mistake, run out of town, or jailed for months awaiting a trial that never came. 4. Gunfights weren't noble, and they weren't rare. Hollywood loves to portray gunfights as rare, dramatic showdowns between two skilled opponents who respect each other. The truth? Most shootings were drunk, dirty, and unfair. They happened in bars, alleys, gambling halls, and family homes. In brawls, robberies, arguments over cattle, or insults. Often while one person was unarmed or shot in the back. Gunfights weren't about justice. They were about ego, territory, and rage. And despite the myth, many towns actually had strict gun laws. Dodge City, Tombstone, and Abilene all passed ordinances requiring guns to be surrendered upon entering town limits. Why? Because even back then, people knew the mixture of booze, stress, and firearms was explosive. But enforcement was hit or miss. And when violence erupted, the sheriff might arrive too late, or not at all. 5. The traveling judge, justice on a schedule. In many parts of the West, there weren't enough judges to go around. So the government created a system of circuit judges, legal officials who traveled from town to town, hearing cases as they went. This meant months could pass between a crime and a trial. Dozens of cases were heard in one day, often rushed and poorly investigated. Juries were biased, made up of townsfolk who often knew the accused. Legal records were spotty or non-existent. If you were wrongly accused, Justice might take so long that the community gave up on waiting and acted on its own. And if you were guilty, you had ample time to escape, intimidate witnesses, or bribe officials. 6. Frontier jails, more like holding pens. Jails in the Wild West were rarely secure. Some were little more than wooden shacks, with weak locks and gaps in the walls. Others were made of stone or adobe, often crumbling or overrun with vermin. There were no guards, just a sheriff or deputy stopping by occasionally. No food service, families had to bring meals. Frequent escapes, since tools were easy to smuggle in. And sometimes lynch mobs broke in before a trial could occur. In short, the jail system was just another example of how thin the line between order and chaos really was. 7. Law was a patchwork, not a system. The legal system out west was a messy mix of territorial laws, which changed as new states were formed. Common law from the east, often misapplied. Local customs that carried more weight than written rules. And federal oversight, which was slow, distant, and inconsistent. As a result, contradictions were common, and justice often meant whatever the person in charge decided. What was legal in one town might be punishable in another 50 miles away. People lived with the understanding that laws were guidelines, not guarantees. 8. The legacy of lawlessness. Despite efforts to romanticize frontier justice as rugged or honorable, the truth is clear: the Wild West was lawless by design. The state was weak, resources were few, and communities were forced to improvise. Sometimes, that meant fairness. More often, it meant fear, violence, and retribution. By the early 20th century, as railroads and communication lines expanded, federal authority slowly crept in. But for decades, the West was a place where justice depended on power, not principle. And yet, we still cling to the image of the lone sheriff, the quick-draw hero, the honest cowboy defending the innocent. We forget that most people lived in fear, not just of nature or poverty, but of an unfair, fragile legal system that could turn on them at any moment. So, if you think you could have survived a day in the Wild West, just remember, even the law wasn't on your side. The end of the frontier and the birth of the legend. After trudging through a dozen exhausting, unsentimental truths about life in the American West, you might be wondering, how did such a harsh, cruel, and chaotic chapter in U.S. history turn into the golden, romantic myth we see in movies and books? Because make no mistake, the Wild West, as it really existed, ended long before most of us think. But instead of fading into memory, it was reborn as legend, packaged for mass consumption, and sold to generations of Americans as a story of heroism, freedom, and rugged individualism. So let's close this series by peeling back the curtain on how the frontier actually ended, and how it was transformed into one of the most durable myths in American culture. 1. The frontier closes, not with a bang, but with a railroad whistle. The so-called frontier wasn't a line, it was a shifting, ever-moving edge of settlement and conquest. By the late 1800s, that edge was disappearing fast. Railroads crisscrossed the continent, bringing with them goods and luxuries from the east. Settlers looking for farmland, jobs, or a new life. Troops and lawmen to enforce federal authority. And most significantly, industry. The wild, unregulated economy of trapping, cattle driving, and gold prospecting was gradually replaced by corporate mining companies with deep pockets, factory farming and commercial agriculture, rail monopolies dictating prices and routes. By 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier officially closed. There were no longer vast, unsettled territories, just states, counties, and property lines. Even the rugged cowboy had become a relic, often employed by massive ranching outfits or laid off entirely. The age of individual grit and lawless opportunity was over. The modern age had arrived, with banks, bureaucrats, and borders. 2. The West becomes a memory, then a fantasy. But something strange happened as the frontier disappeared. Americans didn't let it go. In fact, they clung to it harder than ever. Writers, artists, and entertainers began romanticizing what had just ended. The real West, grimy, dangerous, and unequal, was scrubbed clean and reimagined as a land of noble cowboys, brave settlers, and honorable showdowns at high noon. Some of the earliest culprits included Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show, starting in 1883, a traveling spectacle that blended real frontier figures with fiction, including Native Americans playing themselves as villains and victims in staged battles. Dime novels, cheap, widely distributed books full of exaggerated tales of gunslingers, stagecoach chases, and beautiful schoolmarms in peril. Painters like Frederick Remington, who depicted the West full of stoic cowboys, majestic landscapes, and heroic lawmen. These depictions had little in common with the actual history, but they were emotionally satisfying. They gave Americans something they craved, a national origin myth. 3. Why the myth caught fire. At the turn of the century, the United States was undergoing massive, disorienting change. Cities were booming, factories were rising, immigration was transforming demographics, and traditional American values felt under threat. The Wild West myth offered comfort. It said, "We came from bold men and strong women. We tamed wilderness. We fought evil with courage and grit." It painted over the complexity of history with a simpler, cleaner story, one where good guys wore white hats, bad guys wore black, and justice always won by sunset. In a time of confusion, the cowboy became a symbol of authentic American identity, even if that identity was largely made up. 4. Hollywood picks up the lasso. The 20th century turned the myth into a global export. By the 1930s, Hollywood westerns were pumping out hundreds of films, starring John Wayne as the ultimate American hero, Clint Eastwood in gritty, spaghetti westerns that gave violence a poetic edge, and endless casts of stereotyped Native Americans, helpless women, and cowardly city folk. These movies rarely showed the squalid living conditions, the exploitation of Chinese laborers or Mexican farmers, the genocidal treatment of Native Americans, or the suffocating, bone-breaking labor that defined frontier life. Instead, they offered a clean, epic morality play, where the West was won by virtue and violence, usually in that order. Television followed suit. By the 1950s and 60s, shows like Gunsmoke, Bonanza, and The Lone Ranger brought the myth into American living rooms weekly. Kids played cowboys and Indians. Theme parks and merchandise followed. The real West was long gone, but the fake one was everywhere. 5. Who got left out? Again, this new Western myth erased as much as it celebrated. In the legendary version of the West, women existed mostly to be rescued or romanticized. Black cowboys, who made up roughly 25% of real cattle drivers, were erased or turned into sidekicks. Native Americans were villains, victims, or background noise, never full people. Latino settlers, Chinese railroad workers, and others were invisible or caricatured. Even white settlers and cowboys were idealized beyond recognition. They didn't stink from lack of baths. They didn't suffer from scurvy or dysentery. They didn't freeze, starve, or die at 35. The Wild West myth wasn't just nostalgic, it was selective amnesia. A story America told itself to feel proud, not to feel accurate. 6. The legacy today. The West still looms large in American culture. You see it in political speeches that invoke frontier spirit, video games like Red Dead Redemption, full of beauty and violence, country music and fashion, with cowboy boots, wide-brimmed hats, and outlaw imagery, advertising that equates freedom with open plains and dusty trails. But there's been a slow, growing reckoning. Books, films, and historians have begun to re-examine the West, telling more inclusive, more honest stories. Novels like Lonesome Dove complicate the cowboy hero. Movies like Deadwood, The Revenant, and The Power of the Dog show the grime and brutality. Documentaries and indigenous voices are reclaiming the erased narratives. Because to truly understand the West is to understand America itself, not just what we were, but what we pretended to be. 7. So, could you survive a day in the Wild West? After 13 parts, the answer should be obvious: probably not. You'd face disease, dehydration, loneliness, violence, racism, bad dentistry, and worse hygiene. You might never see justice. You'd almost certainly never see a doctor. And if you were anyone other than a white man with property, your odds of survival dropped further still. But the myth? That would survive just fine. Because the story of the West, scrubbed clean and replayed with music and slow motion, was never really about the past. It was about the story Americans wanted to believe. And if that story helps you fall asleep at night, well, maybe it still serves a purpose. The complex legacy of the Wild West. Now that we've trudged through the rough terrain of 13 parts filled with disease, violence, hardship, and disillusionment, it's time to look back and ask the final question: what did it all mean? Because even though the Wild West ended more than a century ago, its fingerprints are still all over America today, in its laws, its culture, its sense of identity, and even its land. This isn't just a story about survival or mythology. It's a story about legacy. And like most legacies, the one left behind by the Wild West is messy, contradictory, and hard to untangle. 1. The law was weak, but it sparked modern justice. Remember how law enforcement was sparse, judges were sometimes miles away, and vigilantism was a daily reality? That Wild West disorder helped fuel a long-term movement for stronger local governments, sheriff departments, and more structured legal systems. But it also left behind a romantic attachment to frontier justice, the idea that individuals can and should take the law into their own hands. That belief has influenced everything from gun culture to neighborhood watches to certain controversial interpretations of the Second Amendment. In other words, the Wild West helped build both America's desire for order and its stubborn resistance to authority. 2. American individualism, rooted in survival, not freedom. One of the most enduring cultural legacies of the West is the myth of the rugged individualist, the idea that anyone can survive and succeed with hard work, grit, and maybe a six-shooter. That myth has had real effects. It helped shape America's economic philosophy: free markets, minimal government interference. The national identity, self-reliance, distrust of elites, belief in personal destiny. American storytelling, lone heroes in films, novels, and political speeches. But here's the thing: real frontier survival was deeply communal. People joined wagon trains. They shared food. They built towns and relied on neighbors. Even gunfights were often fought in groups, not by lone vigilantes. The legend was built on individuals. The reality was built on communities. That contradiction still shows up today in everything from politics to public health. 3. Environmental damage that still echoes. We often think of the Wild West as a place of natural beauty, towering red rocks, endless plains, crystal clear rivers. But the westward push left scars that are still visible today. Deforestation stripped entire regions of native trees. Mining left behind toxic waste, some of which still seeps into groundwater. Buffalo herds were almost exterminated to undermine native food sources. Soil depletion from over-farming led to long-term agricultural collapse in areas that weren't meant to be settled in the first place. The 20th century Dust Bowl didn't come out of nowhere. It was part of the ecological bill left unpaid by 19th century expansionism. And debates about resource rights, land use, and climate impact are still raging across the West today. 4. A cultural melting pot, with deep fractures. The West wasn't just settled by Anglo-Americans. It was shaped by a rich mix of cultures: Mexican ranchers, whose techniques and vocabulary, like rodeo and lasso, became cowboy staples. Chinese immigrants, who helped build the railroads and cook in mining camps. African Americans, who founded towns, worked as cowboys, and built new lives post-slavery. Indigenous nations, who fought, negotiated, and resisted encroachment with resilience and creativity. Yet while the myth mostly celebrated white settlers, the real West was multicultural. The challenge today is to reclaim and restore that complexity. From bilingual town names to powwows held on old battlegrounds, the West is slowly starting to acknowledge that it was never culturally simple, and never belonged to just one group. 5. The loss and resistance of indigenous identity. Perhaps the most tragic legacy of all is what happened to Native American communities. Populations were decimated by disease, war, and displacement. Languages and customs were suppressed, often violently. Land was seized, turned into reservations, and stripped of its sacred meaning. And yet, despite it all, indigenous cultures survived. Today, many are fighting to reclaim sovereignty, revitalize languages, and restore sacred lands. From environmental activism to education reform, Native nations are reshaping the narrative and refusing to be remembered only as victims of history. The Wild West didn't erase indigenous identity. It tried. But in the long run, resistance proved stronger than conquest. 6. Gender roles that were strained, then transformed. In previous chapters, we saw how women in the West weren't just homemakers, they were farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, defenders, and often, survivors. That dynamic helped crack open traditional gender roles. Some Western territories gave women the right to vote decades before the national law did. Women in the West often had property rights, business roles, and public voices uncommon elsewhere at the time. And though misogyny, exploitation, and violence were rampant, there were also spaces for female leadership and independence. The image of the frontier woman evolved, from damsel in distress to pistol-wielding pioneer, and has influenced everything from feminist westerns to modern debates about gender roles. 7. The myth that still shapes American politics. We ended the last chapter talking about how Hollywood reshaped the Wild West into a fantasy. That fantasy still holds enormous cultural weight. Even today, you'll hear politicians and pundits say things like, "We need to get back to frontier values. This is the new Wild West of innovation." Real Americans are out in the heartland. The West has become a metaphor for freedom, for lawlessness, for patriotism, for rebellion, depending on who's using it. And that's dangerous, because myths are powerful tools, but also dangerous lies when taken at face value. The legacy of the West is not one clean story. It's not a John Wayne film. It's a collection of truths, half-truths, and wishful thinking, all fighting for space in the American imagination. 8. What we keep, what we should let go. So, what do we do with the Wild West now? We can admire the resilience of those who survived, the ingenuity of those who built new homes in unfamiliar territory, the bravery of those who challenged injustice, whether from a corrupt sheriff or a greedy railroad company. But we must also acknowledge the violence and cruelty committed in the name of progress. The cultures trampled, the people erased, the land damaged in ways we're still trying to repair. The legacy of the Wild West is not a straight line from past to present. It's a jagged canyon, deep, dangerous, beautiful, and real. Final thought before you sleep. If this series has taught you anything, it's this: you wouldn't survive a day in the real Wild West. But you live every day in the world it helped create. And understanding that world, its struggles, its lies, its resilience, and its complexity, isn't boring. It's essential. Now close your eyes, and dream not of cowboys, but of context. So, still think you could have survived a day in the Wild West? If the rattlesnakes didn't get you, the disease, violence, or sheer loneliness probably would have. Behind the legends and dusty boots lies a harsh, haunting reality, and that's the story history books often skip. But here on Thunga's Storytime, we shine a light on the real past, the gritty, the strange, the stuff that keeps you thinking long after the video ends. If you loved peeling back the curtain on the myths of the Wild West, don't forget to like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe to Thunga's Storytime. Hit that bell so you never miss another tale that's weirder and wilder than fiction. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes, the truth makes the best bedtime story.
gỡ cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó có đỏ đâu, không quay không phải đâu. Nó không có đỏ. Nói xịn kìa chứ nói vậy quay đâu.
Thì chớp nhán được rồi. Nó dằn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gỡ cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó có đỏ đâu, không quay không phải đâu. Nó không có đỏ. Nói xịn kìa chứ nói vậy quay đâu.
Thì chớp nhán được rồi. gỡ cho em Thịnh.
quay nó có đỏ đâu, không quay như vậy. Không có đỏ. Má xịn kìa, chứ má này quay đâu.
Thì chớp nhán được rồi. tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó có đỏ đâu, không quay như vậy. Không có đỏ. Máy xịn kìa, như máy này quay đâu.
Thì chớp chớp nhán nhán được rồi. Dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó
chớp nhăn